Welcome back to another Free Flight Friday here on the channel, and this is a video I've wanted to do for a while. So this video is basically an idiot's guide, that means it's the Sunday pilot's guide, to the key differences between flying the Aerosoft Airbus Professional A320 in prepared 3D version 4.5 and of course the PMDG 737. So what I've decided to do in this video is file exactly the same flight plan in SimBrief between here at London's Gatwick Airport and Belfast International Airport, also known as Aldergrove. I've manually set the weather in active sky. I'll be departing in both aircrafts on runway 26 left here at London Gatwick, following exactly the same SID, routing us to the east of London before heading north towards the Midlands, Manchester and across the Irish Sea towards the Isle of Man, and hopefully getting the same vectors into ILS runway 25 at Aldergrove. SimBrief chose Dublin as the alternate, but I changed that to Glasgow International EGPF. In the real world, I'd guess that EasyJet would probably use Glasgow International as its alternate, and Ryanair would probably use Glasgow Prestwick. But let's face it guys, this is the virtual world and I can do pretty well anything I want. Like all of the videos here on the Sim Sunday YouTube channel, this is not a tutorial video. There's plenty of great tutorial videos on YouTube. So my objective of this video is to show you the very high level differences between the PMDG 737 NGXU and of course the Aerosoft Airbus Professional, in this case the A320, from the Airbus family, which I have the A318 through the A321. And of course I chose the two low-cost kings of Europe, and of course that means EasyJet in the Airbus and Ryanair in the Boeing. Ryanair use the south terminal at London Gatwick, and while they typically don't use jet bridges, I was having some GSX issues on the morning that I recorded this flight, and that's why a jet bridge is currently connected to this gorgeous PMDG 737 at Gatwick's South Terminal. But back at Gatwick's North Terminal, EasyJet certainly do use the jetways from time to time, so it's connected and ready to accept cargo and passengers on this short 1 hour and 10-minute flight to Belfast International. I should say that in the past, both EasyJet and Ryanair have both flown this service between London Gatwick and Belfast Aldergrove. So let's jump right into the cockpit, starting with the Airbus, and look at the key differences between both aircraft in the eyes of an amateur virtual pilot. And just as a reminder, we're in prepared 3D version 4.5. The first thing to get your head around, or should I say the first thing that I had to get my head around, is that the Airbus is a much more modern aircraft than the Boeing. The overhead panel is based on a lights out concept with buttons rather than the switches that you'll see shortly in the Boeing. The first thing I've done here is power up the APU in advance of the passengers coming on board. And next I move to the FMC. The Aerosoft Airbus has two FMCs, and this one is where we set our passenger cargo and fuel load, which today for both the Boeing and the Airbus will be setting to 140 passengers, just 3 tons of cargo and approximately 7 metric tons of fuel. In this sim control FMC we also set the state of the aircraft, which for the purposes of this video is set to turnaround state, and we can also set the wheel chocks and access to ground power. The main FMC here in the Airbus has also been pre-programmed from SimBrief, and the beautiful thing in the Airbus, it is all pretty well automated. Pop in a flat setting of 2 and the V-speeds are automatically populated into the FMC, and while in managed mode the FMC will fully control the aircraft both vertically and laterally, including speed. One thing that I do find with the Airbus FMC, it is not as accurate as the PMDG. Quite often SIDs are not that accurate, which was the case on this flight as we departed Gatwick on runway 26 left. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. Over to the cockpit in the Boeing 737-800 of Ryanair, it's pretty well the same process. There is a single FMC with a control menu where you can also set the wheel chocks, add ground power, and of course open and close the doors. It is also where you set the fuel load, the passenger load, and of course the cargo load. Just like in the Aerosoft Airbus Professional, the FMC loading procedure overwrites everything else in prepared. Moving to the overhead panel in the Boeing, it is more of a switch concept rather than a button concept, but the process is pretty similar to that of the Airbus, including the powering up of the APU. However, in the Boeing I always check the fuel load, and as you can see the FMC has automatically loaded the fuel into both the left and the right wing tanks, leaving the centre tank empty. So all I'm doing here is switching off the pumps to the centre tank. I found that the PMDG FMC is a lot more accurate when it comes to the nav page than the Airbus. From Aerosoft. All of the SIDs and the arrival procedures are very well documented and presented in the PMDG FMC. However, there's always a few additional procedures in the Boeing over the Airbus. And while I'm not showing it here, one process that jumps to mind that takes a little bit longer in the Boeing is configuring the performance page, including V-speeds. And when you're ready to transfer power from the ground power unit to the APU, you must remember to set the bus switches. One of the other areas that is slightly different in the Boeing is that you need to set your cruise altitude and your landing altitude for cabin altitude purposes. In this case, I've set the landing altitude to 200 feet, which is as near as we can get if I've got to come back here to Gatwick. And of course, I've set the cruise altitude to 34,000 feet. And that's really it, guys, with the FMC programmed the passengers, cargo and fuel all on board. There's nothing else to do now except ask for pushback and clearance, in this case to Belfast International Airport, Aldergrove.
Ryanair 45 Golf cleared to Aldergrove Airport as filed. Fly runway heading, climb and maintain altitude 12,000. Departure on 126.825, squawk 6102.
Hello, Captain. We are ready for pushback. Departure check completed. Bypass pin inserted. Release parking brakes.
Gatwick ground, going straight.
Tow truck disconnected. Bypass pin removed. Unlocking gear.
Being a Sunday pilot, as you can imagine, I'm not following any checklists. However, unlike the Airbus with the Boeing, you've got to remember to set the bus switches to ensure that electricity is coming from the engines and not the APU. It is always very embarrassing when you forget to do this and all of the lights go dark in the cabin. Other than that, the pre-taxi process in both aircraft are pretty similar. Set the flaps to the appropriate position. However, in the Airbus, set the auto brakes to maximum in case you abandon the takeoff roll. But in the Boeing, you set the auto brakes to RTO. And of course, with a long runway like we have here in Gatwick, I tend to set the flaps in the Boeing to 5 and 2 in the Airbus. And to be honest, for me, that tends to be it. It's now time for me to ask for taxi clearance to runway 26 left here at Gatwick, which is our departure runway for this flight to Belfast Aldergrove.
Gatwick ground, Ryanair 45 Golf with information, Lima, West taxi, IFR.
Ryanair 45 Golf, taxi holding point with runway 26 left, via taxiway Kilo, November, Alpha, contact tower on 124.225 when ready.
In my mind, there is absolutely no difference when taxiing either the Aerosoft Airbus Professional or the PMDG Boeing 737NG. However, in real life, I believe that some airlines flying the Boeing 737 do not have a nose wheel tiller on the co-pilot side. And as we arrive at the holding point for London Gatwick's runway 26 left, despite me trying my very best to match the times of both these flights as best I could, I was never in any doubt that Ultimate Traffic Live would spawn up different traffic at the departure point. And as it becomes our turn to depart, it's time to ask for takeoff clearance.
Tower AEC 45 Golf, ready to go. Runway 26 left, IFR, Aldergrove. Ryanair 45 Golf, hold short. Runway 26 left, traffic is Boeing 737 on upwind.
At the point of entering the runway, the process in both aircraft of switching on the TCAS and then the weather radar is exactly the same, even though the switches are in slightly different places. And finally, it's time to turn on the landing lights.
5.
226 left. On runway 26 left.
Decimal 825, bird 2770, thanks, 55. PC 45 Golf, cleared for takeoff. Runway 26 left, surface. Golf.
Gatwick Tower 19.
The actual takeoff process in both aircraft is quite different. So let's start with the EasyJet Airbus A320. This is a nice long runway at London Gatwick, so as I push the throttles forward, you're going to hear 2 clicks. The throttles in the Airbus are really just a great big switch. The first click will take us into the climb position and the second click into flex. The third click would take us into toga, but this being a very long runway, we don't need to. The flex position will automatically derate the engines, reducing wear and tear.
Up this way, runway 26 left.
Line up this way, 81991.
With the landing gear coming up, it will soon be time to engage the autopilot. You will see circles next to the speed, heading and altitude selector in the cockpit. These circles signify that we're in managed mode, and that means that the Airbus is taking its command from the FMC, and as a result the aircraft will simply follow the pre-programmed flight plan in the FMC, including both vertical and lateral navigation. And this of course includes the speed as the aircraft follows the standard instrument departure, or what is known as the SID. And when not following the speed restrictions in the SID, the Airbus will accelerate to 250 knots below 10,000 feet, and when passing through 10,000 feet, the Airbus will then increase its speed based on the cost index set in the FMC. And as we depart on autopilot following the SID, I'm keeping a constant eye on the primary flight display, selecting flaps up at the appropriate point and setting the thrust levers to climb level when instructed. And then the throttles will remain in the climb level position for the rest of the flight. And that's how the Sunday pilot, and therefore an amateur virtual pilot, departs Gatwick in an Airbus A320 from Aerosoft. So let's pop back to runway 26 left at Gatwick and see how I do it in the PMDG Boeing 737 NGXU. The first thing to note on the Boeing is the throttles are much more traditional throttles, so the further you push them forward, the more power you'll get. However, to reduce the wear and tear on the Boeing 737 engine, I've already told the FMC to derate the engines by 10%. So as I push the thrust levers forward, I will then push the toga button, the takeoff and go around button. And with the auto throttle armed, the aircraft will maintain the V2 speed, which is 147 knots today. With the landing gear in the Boeing coming up, it will soon be time for me to push the command button, and for this flight I'm going to be pushing the command A button, or the left hand autopilot. And at approximately 1400 feet I'll also be engaging the VNAV and LNAV buttons. And it's here that I should say that command is really the same as managed in the Airbus. The aircraft is taking its directions from the FMC, the flight management computer, and just as I did in the Airbus, I'm keeping my eye on the primary flight display, selecting flaps up at the appropriate time. And because the Boeing is using a more traditional throttle design, the correct speed will be maintained from the FMC and of course the SID, and leaving the SID, the Boeing will do exactly the same as the Airbus, and that means staying at 250 knots below 10,000 feet, before increasing speed under the direction of the FMC and whatever you've set the cost index to. For both these flights between Gatwick and Aldergrove, I've set the cost index to 19. The real Airbus pilot tells me me that the cost index used by Ryanair in the 737-800 is 19, but I'm really not too sure what EasyJet use. So I've just gone with a cost index of 19 to keep both flights very similar. And that, guys, is how I depart in the PMDG 737 NGXU in prepared 3D version 4.5. And turning north, departing the SID overhead the River Thames, both the Airbus and the Boeing will simply follow the pre-programmed flight plan from the FMC. In this case to flight level 340 or 34,000 feet in the direction of Birmingham, then Manchester, and then starting an initial descent for Belfast Aldergrove International Airport overhead the Isle of Man. Because both aircraft were following exactly the same flight plan. ATC instructed us to descend while we were overhead the Isle of Man, which is a destination I'd like to try to fly to in a future video. And both aircraft approached the Belfast area overhead Bangor and Belfast Lough towards Carrickfergus and Newton Abbey. And if you would like to have a closer look at this area in Flight Sim, take a look back to the last two videos where I flew from Straven to Newtonards in both Prepared and Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 in a DA62 from Diamond. And again, following exactly the same flight plan, both the Airbus and the Boeing were being vectored towards runway 25 at Belfast Aldergrove. Just like in the departure, the approach phase in both the Airbus and the Boeing are very slightly different. With the Airbus having a more advanced level of automation, the aircraft knows that it's in approach phase, and therefore while flying in full managed mode, it is not just following ILS guidance, but also holding the correct speeds. The thrust levers remain in the climb position until touchdown and the voice command tells us to retard. Back in the Boeing 737 of Ryanair, as we make our final approach overhead the M2 motorway, the autopilot is also following the ILS guidance and holding its speed. However, in the 737 we will disconnect the auto throttle and the autopilot at an appropriate point in the descent and hopefully bring the aircraft to a smooth landing under the pilot's own control.
Approaching 25.
$400. $300.
Glide slow. Glide slow.
$200.
Glide slow. Glide slow. Glide slow.
$100.
Glide slow.
$50.
Glide slow.
$40. $30. Retard. Retard. Retard.
Approaching minimums. Minimums.
Glide slow. Glide slow. Glide slow. Glide slow. Glide slow. Glide slow. Glide slow.
20. 10.
One thing that you will notice on touchdown is the brakes in the Boeing 737 are a lot less efficient than those of the Airbus. And even with carbon brakes on the Boeing, you will find that the Airbus stops much quicker on the runway than the Boeing. Leaving the runway, the process in both aircraft are pretty similar. Switch on the APU and switch off the landing lights before turning on the taxi lights, before turning your attention to the weather radar and the TCAS. But in reality, that's it guys. These are the differences that I find between flying the Airbus and the Boeing 737. I'm often asked which is my favourite tube liner to fly in prepared, and despite loving both this PMDG 737 and of course this Aerosoft Airbus Professional A320, the Quality Wings 787 Dreamliner for prepared 3D version 4.5 is still my favourite tube liner. So as I taxi to the gate at Belfast Aldergrove Airport, it's time to bring another episode of Sim Sunday and Free Flight Friday to a close. And it's at this point in the video I'd like to take the opportunity to personally thank my friend and channel co-host, the Real Airbus Pilot, for his time, dedication and absolute patience, for helping me to get to grips with these study level aircraft in prepared. Without his help and support, I'm not sure that I would ever learn to fly this Aerosoft Airbus or the PMDG 737. I know that we jokingly refer to him as aviation's version of the Stig, but hopefully you'll understand that he is a real world pilot in an industry that's very sensitive to what's said on social media. So if you have enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, and the best thanks the Real Airbus Pilot and I can get is your subscription to this channel. And until the next video, wherever you're flying in your virtual world, don't forget to fly safe.